The Lexus LS430 is possibly one of the best sedans Lexus ever made. They're even better than the LS460, which can be more complicated, can be more expensive to own, and while they're also good if you take care of them, these are a lot better. They're a lot more DIY friendly. They feel better, they drive better, and if you buy the right one, you will be very happy with these. So in today's video, I want to share with you some of their common problems and things you need to know, including the pre-facelift, the post-facelifts, ultra, custom, what's the option, what's the ultimate one to buy, and what you should check on these exactly before you buy one. Buy the wrong one of these and it will not be a happy experience. But if you buy the right one and you know what you're getting yourself into, you will enjoy these cars and you will have them for a very long time with miles and miles of comfort, quiet, and reliability. Let's get started. Let's talk about the common things under the hood. Before we talk about the common things, this is the best part of the LS430, the 430 part, the engine. Folks, this engine is possibly one of the best engines to come out of Lexus. It is the 3UZ FE, and even before that, the 1UZ FE. I have been inside so little of these, I can count them on my fingers. I have been inside every single Toyota Lexus engine up to the modern times. I can count how many times it's been inside of these, and it is usually because of error from users, not taking care of them. This engine, even with abuse, will easily last a very long time. You guys know about my 600,000 mile Lexus. We even looked inside of it. Runs perfectly fine, even gets good gas mileage. Let's start with the main thing with this engine, because they do have a few things that are super common. First one is oil leaks. So if you have a pre-facelift 2001, 2003, in addition to the valve cover gasket, which is notoriously common on these, all years, regardless, valve cover is super common, very easy to check. Even you don't have to remove covers and whatnot. You just look between the two cover, the silver cover and the black cover on both sides. You'll see oil coming down. You look at the exhaust manifold in the back, you'll see it covered with oil. We got a valve cover gasket leak. That is super simple. On the pre-facelift though, the oil filter housing loves to leak as well. It has a little gasket, kind of an 8-figure gasket. That is a little tougher to see. You have to see it underneath. And when we take a tour of one of these underneath, we'll talk about that. Another thing that is becoming common with these as they get older, the wire harness is not very good with heat and age. They start to crumple, connectors start falling apart, and that is something you really got to watch for. This is more on the service side. If you're going to DIY these cars, be gentle with connectors. If something breaks, replace it. Majority of these connectors are still available. The entire engine harness is available. Speaking of available, we're going to talk about availability of parts on these because that's a whole different section. More stuff on these, and the issues under the hood are a little bit age related. For example, the power steering system, for the most part, they are very rugged and reliable. The power steering pump, the previous generation LS400, they had all kind of problems, and this, nothing. There's one thing that kills the power steering system on these that people don't notice. The power steering reservoir has a filter in it, and because the fluid, people really in those days didn't change fluids for the power steering. It gets so heavily gummed up that it plugs that filter, and the moment it plugs that filter, the power steering pump is gone and we're back to square one. Preventatively, it wouldn't be a bad idea to replace the power steering reservoir and the hoses that connect to it because they're 100% hard, brittle, and you need to replace them. That is one of the things under the hood. But then there is the car care nut stuff under the hood that you need to look at when you're buying one of these. Look at the covers. See, this car is a very low mile car, so is this one. If you look at the covers, like if you look at this intake piece right here, which by the way hides the radiator, very simple, 2 clips and comes out. If your clip does not look like this, you'd want to investigate accidents, because this clip is a unique clip for this, and usually most aftermarket places will not have it. They'll just put whatever clip and it'll never sit right. And also, when you start seeing clips missing and panels missing, you start to wonder who's been working on this car, because that's how these cars can be the greatest cars or the worst cars when the wrong mechanic gets a hold of them. And the last thing that usually scares people away from these cars, the timing belt. Folks, this is an interference engine. So if your timing belt breaks, unfortunately you're going to have severe damage, and that's one of the cases that I've replaced an engine on one. The timing belt interval is officially 90,000 miles or 9 years. From experience, you can stretch that to 100,000 miles, 10 years safely. It is an expensive timing belt to replace labor-wise, but it's actually not extremely difficult. Of all the UZ series engine, the LS430 is probably the easiest one to change on. The only thing you could DIY it in a garage. The only thing you have to go underneath is to disconnect the radiator and disconnect the compressor. I do have a video on that timing belt. I'll leave it right here so you guys can check it out if you're DIYing this. But otherwise, the timing belt replacement is a simple job, a little bit costly if you're paying somebody. But addition to the timing belt, if you have over 100,000 miles on these, every time you do a timing belt, you'd want to put a drive belt tensioner and a drive belt idler. For some reason beyond my understanding, the drive belt tensioner is cheap. Believe it or not, it's only $106 for a drive belt tensioner that is OEM part. That's not bad. But the idler that is half the size and does half the function is $128 as of the date of filming this video. For reasons unknown, that idler costs a lot, but they're notorious to go, so always replace them when you do the timing belt if you have over 100,000 miles. And if you have belt chirping or repeating belt chirping problems, it's the tensioner. They're actually very common to go on these. And one note on service. Let's say you're DIYing this, you want to replace the coolant. Remember that these are a little bit older cars that come from a different generation. You have to leave the heat on these when you bleed them, unlike most Toyotas and Lexus models, newer stuff, because this has a heat valve. Basically, that heat valve sits all the way in the back. All it does is, when you're using AC, it cuts off the coolant flow to the heater core, and now you don't have heat going inside, so the AC would work better. These are known to have really good AC system because of that. So if you're bleeding coolant on these, it's very simple. Just run the car until the fans come on. AC off, heater on, full hot. And that's as simple as that to bleed them. Let's start with talking about the different the pre-facelift and the post-facelift and the details of the two, and more importantly, which one is better. So this is the pre-facelift, or 2001 to 2003 model. This is what debuted 3 LS430, and in some people's opinion, it is the lesser looking one and the lesser reliable one. To a point, that is correct, because all the issues they had with these got fixed with the facelift. We're going to talk about the facelift in a little bit. Let's talk about the trims within the pre-facelift and the post-facelift. So the main trims are, there is the base model, then there is the Ultra that everybody seems to want, which they shouldn't. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Then there is a trim that is custom, which has some of the cool things from the Ultra, but not everything. And that trim is a little bit harder to find, and a little bit, they didn't make a lot of them. So you're gonna have a hard time finding one of these. But then on the facelift model, the one that everybody wants because they look better, and they do, and they fixed a lot of things, and they added a few more options, and things are better. We also have the base model, the custom, and the Ultra, which has all the bells and whistles. But you also have one more model in these. You have the Sport, which this one happens to be a Sport model. So let's dive in a little bit deeper into the pre-facelift so you guys can see it up close and know the difference. So the difference between this one and this one is the headlight shape, the hood, the bumper, and the front fender. In case you're getting ideas for conversion. It's a very expensive conversion, by the way. But you notice the front is completely different, but it is in a sense the same. They elongated the headlights here. They changed the fender because now the headlight goes a lot into the fender, and the hood is actually completely different. You notice the curve here is completely different. The grille is bigger, and I think it has to be said, even though I am a little biased towards the pre-facelift model because I own one, but this does look better. Now, as far as technology and kind of getting into the little stuff, because some people will say, oh, this looks more complicated, this is simpler. That's actually not the case. These do come with bi-xenon headlights. They do have the headlight leveling. But if you notice here, you have kind of a reflector style HID headlight. On the newer ones, you have a lens. So these will tend to have a little bit better lighting at night. That's the only improvement. Of course, when they went to the facelift, they improved things. But as you walk towards the side, they are exactly the same. They changed nothing on the side at all. They're exactly the same. You can't tell one from another, and that's how it is. However, the facelift model got a little bit different wheels, slightly different wheels. The sport one, which has possibly the best wheel in my opinion, this is the best looking wheel. It is a bigger wheel than the regular ones. And then this is the standard wheel. This wheel actually carried over into the post facelift as well. And there's a chrome version of this one, which you can see it on mine, the white one. That is the chrome version of that. But as we wrap around, this is where things start to change again. If you look at the pre-facelift model, you notice the taillights are different. So is the trunk. The taillights here are more like, it has amber in it. They're a little bit more understated. The bumper, a little bit more understated. Nothing really to it. It's a very basic bumper. But if you look at the post facelift, you have different taillights that look a lot more modern. They look nicer. The bumper is different and it looks nicer. On the inside, there were a few changes. On initial glance, when you look at this one, just from far away, you look at it, and then you look at the pre-facelift. To a point, they look very, very similar. But there is actually a lot of differences, and let's talk about them. So the main difference between the pre-facelift model and the post-facelift model when you get inside is the gauges. So they changed the color of the gauges. This was more like old school colors. That one is newer. They are not interchangeable. But aside from the obvious stuff, there was a revision to the navigation system, which makes it a little bit better. There was a revision to the amplifier, which makes it better. And there was a lot of little stuff that are hard to notice. Like some of the materials, the biggest change though that you will notice, the seat material. So the leather changed from this to the post facelift. It is known that the 2001 to 2003, the leather does not hold up as well as the 2004, 2006. They did something with the seats. They either changed the material or the kind of leather. They just hold up so much better. Same thing with the steering wheel. However, both of them still have this. The wood on the steering wheel loves to crack. You will be very hard pressed to find one this is not cracked. They develop like mini cracks, and that's just how it is. And it's the same thing with the post facelift. Now, the post facelift added kind of a few more options. You get into the lower trims, you could get stuff like cooled seats. You'll see them a lot more common on the post facelift than you will on the pre-facelift, unless you go into the higher trims. In my opinion, this is the one to get. As much as I love my white one, but that was a whole different thing. This is the one to get because it's specifically 05, 06, because the navigation, after the revision that they did have some issues with the navigation screen, just going blank or causing all kinds of issues, causing the AC to stop working. And better yet, because this navigation system, absolutely obsolete, by the way. There's no updates for it. It's horrible, doesn't even work well. If you're gonna buy one, they're harder to find, because in those times, everybody wanted the screen. That was the cool thing to do, I guess it still is. But if you find one without the navigation, and they are out there, that would be the one to buy, because you could add a nice radio to it, and you'll have modern features, and you don't have to deal with this whole screen mess of the navigation, because that adds a lot. And this is what we're going to talk about right now. If you're buying one of these, instead of checking every little electronic gizmo that works, you should check the radio and make sure it works well, because more of what we're going to talk about. Let's go visit the trunk, because if there is any disaster with the LS430, it would be the decisions Lexus did with the trunk. The first thing is, this one actually needs shock replacements. These are super common, same thing with the hood. These are very heavy panels, and this shock will not hold this trunk, so I'm going to keep my hand here. They decided to put the amplifier, the DVD unit, the tuner for the radio, and a giant fuse block on the edges of the trunk, very low. And usually when you put stuff very low in a car, that's the first place that gets dunked in water. That was the Achilles heels of these. They had such complicated electronics for the time, but we were not too advanced with electronics to a point where things were simplified. Things were extremely complicated. So whenever you're buying one of these, the first thing you're gonna look at is you're gonna come to this area, pull the carpet back, pull this panel back, and look in this area. This is the DVD unit for the navigation. This is the tuner, and then the amplifier will be up high. If you see any signs of water in this area, you're walking away from this car. Do yourself a favor and walk away. And equally on this side. If I peel this side off and we take a quick look, that's a fuse block right on the ground of the car, right next to the vent where water could get in, and they're common to get in here. And if you have one with a smart key, this is a huge thing. This is how you catch them without even looking at this stuff. If you have one with a smart key, the smart key will not work unless you hold it right in this area. If that is the case, I almost can guarantee you there's water here that dunked the old school smart key system, receiver and transmitter, and these are very expensive. So the first thing you check on these before you start looking at your power seats, which always work. I am yet to see one not work. Mirrors, we'll talk about them next, but people will spend so much time checking the gizmos. This is what you should be checking, because all these gizmos, they all will work all the time. Now, the Ultra model in the back seat will have the entertainment center console, and the seat will move, and if you open the center armrest right here, you'll have all kinds of buttons and gizmos. Unfortunately, this is not an Ultra, this is a Sport, but the Ultras we will dedicate an entire section to, because you got to be careful with the Ultras. Now the mirrors. The mirrors are a thing with the LS430. So these mirrors, if you live up north where there is rust, you could be okay. But if you live in hot areas, these mirrors love to come apart. The hinge breaks, especially if you're folding them, unfolding them all the time, they will break. And these mirrors are extremely expensive. Metal body mirror and up till here, they're very expensive to replace, and they still make them, so that's good. But be gentle with these mirrors. You go in the car wash, that would be the time to fold them. But don't try to fold them all the time, especially if you have an older one or you live in a hot climate area. Don't try to fold them all the time, because when these break, things are going to get very expensive. And that's the thing which is going to lead us to our next section. So are these ultra expensive cars to maintain? And hence the emphasis on ultra. Folks, these cars can get expensive if you buy the wrong one, or you have one and you maintain it the wrong way. For example, I'll run with you a few examples so you can see how this kind of goes downhill. If you live in rusty land, we're going to talk a little bit about this when we look underneath one. Mufflers are extremely expensive for these. They love to rust and they love to make noise. And to replace the mufflers, you have no aftermarket option. There's only the originals, which are very expensive, or you can go to a muffler shop and they'll just weld one. The car will never sound right, stop vibrating, and now the reason you bought this car for its smoothness and very nice ride goes out the window. Then the brakes. The brakes are extremely expensive on these cars, compared to your Camry though, but not compared to a big luxury sedan. That's the thing you got to remember. You're not upgrading from a Camry into this car. That should not be the mentality. Oh, these are just like a Camry. You cannot expect Camry level or Corolla level or even Highlander level or Avalon level maintenance costs in these cars. It's simply not going to happen. You get this car, get it clean, but eventually something's going to happen. For example, door locks. They love to go out on these. It's an older car. They can get expensive OEM. There are options for aftermarket, yes, but if you want the longevity, you're gonna want to invest in the original stuff. Rack and pinion, for example, extremely expensive. Ask me how I know that. I just put a brand new one in mine. They're very expensive. However, you go get an aftermarket one, it simply will not last. These are heavy cars. You need to put original stuff in these cars. And the Ultra, the expensive part, the Ultra trim, possibly the most overrated of this model, because you get air suspension. And I have driven every single LS430 possible now in the shop, and before that when I was working for a dealership. You will have a very hard time finding the difference between the air suspension one and the non-air suspension one. The only time you'll really tell a difference is when you go at highway speeds in a road that is not even. You'll notice the air suspension one will behave better. But that is such a little advantage over the huge disadvantage of the air suspension. Folks, it is leaps and bounds ahead of any German rivals on reliability. But remember, the newest one of these is a 2006. That's a pretty old car. Air suspension on these, expensive, totally expensive. Avoid the air suspension altogether. Yes, there are conversion kits, but now you're buying a car with a kind of a ticking time clock, where I'm waiting for this air suspension to go so I can convert it. Well, why don't you just buy a regular one and not have to deal with it? I know the Ultra has more cool features, and then the soft closed doors on the Ultras. If you find yourself with a not working door lock and an Ultra with a soft closed door, it will be thousands to fix them. Each door will cost you over $1,000 just to replace the door lock. While you could buy the regular one and it'll cost you probably 1/3 that. The Ultra model is not worth it. And I know some Ultra owners out there will get offended, but that's the truth. We're talking about the best one to buy and the one that is not going to be very high in maintenance cost. The Ultra one will be the most expensive one. The Sport one will be a little expensive. These are bigger wheels with bigger tires, and the struts are special for these. And then the base model or the custom or anything, any combination of options in between will be the one you want. And even though it is a little obvious, this question, which one is the best year to buy? What is the best one to buy? In my opinion, 2005 and 2006 are the best years to buy. The early ones, the transmission was a little of a question mark. It was not as good as the later ones. 2004 was a year that they had some issues with the radio, the door locks. They had a few issues here and there. 05, 06 though, those were the better years. But the most important, more important than which year you should buy, which condition you should buy. Because you are looking at 4 LS430s in the shop right now. And let me tell you one thing. That one, the one right in front of the camera we started the video with, has under 100,000 miles. And this one has 57,000 miles. The white one, guys might be familiar with that one, has 630,000 miles. And this one has around 180,000 miles. They're all in the shop for something, except this one, she lives here. They're all in the shop for something. And you want to guess which one is here for the most amount of work? Probably the high mile one, Chicago car one. It's actually not. It's this one. This one needs the most amount of work. Not because it was neglected, not because it was not taken care of. These cars have waves of maintenance. For example, both of these cars have had valve cover gaskets done, have had a timing belt done, have had all the fluids gone through multiple times. This one is on its original timing belt, original valve cover gasket, original brakes, and they all need replacement. See what I'm on about? You gotta find the right one. Just because it has low miles and it says Garage Queen doesn't mean it's the one to buy and you're just gonna buy it sight unseen. You really gotta check these cars. And it is essential that you do a pre-purchase inspection. The difference between enjoying one of these cars or feeling like you made one of the biggest mistakes is a second and one bad decision. You gotta check these cars. And more importantly, you gotta check their previous owners. Have they been putting aftermarket parts everywhere just to keep it on the cheap? And you'll immediately tell, brakes will be noisy, car will not feel right. And that's the problem with these. I have a customer, and this is the last example I'll give you, just replaced rear struts on an LS430. It was actually a beautiful custom one. And 2 months later, they were not happy. The car rode better with the original blown struts than it did with the aftermarket struts. And they are coming back to the shop in a few weeks' time so we can revert it back to original so they can have their car back. That was their exact words. Be careful with these cars, folk, and aftermarket parts. Let's take a tour underneath the LS430 as we talk about more of their common things you need to be checking for. For reference, the one we're looking at is a 2004, so this is a post facelift. First thing you notice, this particular one has an aftermarket cover. You notice how it doesn't fit right, and that's the first problem. Not the end of the world, but these are where I tell you, you go aftermarket stuff, it's not going to fit right. There's an oil filter access door right here. Now this aftermarket one slightly doesn't have it. It seems like it's molded there, but this door needs to be there. It doesn't affect your gas mileage if this door has been cut out where the oil filter is. So if you want to inspect one of these and you're able to get this cover off, you'll be able to see every single oil leak very easily, or you can also see it at the top. There's plenty of room. If you remove this, you'll be able to see the front of the engine and the bottom of the radiator. Sits right around this area. See, this particular one has a very small seepage from the oil pan. If you look at it right here, it's slightly wet. That is something not common with these, but this is something of age. I mean, these are older cars. The oil pan on this, however, you got to drop the subframe and it kind of wraps around. It's a big job to do that, and that's one of the downsides of that. Let's look at the front suspension. This is a double wishbone setup. Unlike the LS460, which at this miles and this age would have probably gone through 3 sets of front suspension, at least control arms, the upper control arm is all aluminum. It's very expensive to replace, but they're also not known to go out. Same thing with the lower control arm. Most people will look at these, like if you wrap around and look at this bushing, people will look at this bushing, oh my God, this is completely gone. That's actually fine. It's an older car. You're going to have a few cracks here and there, but there's no movement at all. Same thing here. You look at this one. There's a little bit of cracks on it. That shape, you think that is a complete crack. That is not, folks. In case you see that, don't be alarmed by that. The other thing with these is rust. They're not known to rot completely. I mean, if you look at this area, you do have some rust on the body, but they're not known to rot completely. But what is known to rust is the exhaust. They love to break somewhere in this section. Car all of a sudden super quiet, gets super loud, and this pipe is extremely expensive. It does have a cleanup cat on it, which leads us to the second more expensive part, which is right here, from this area right here. There's a pipe that splits into 2 resonators, and then it goes all the way back to here where the mufflers connect. Looks like a small section, but disconnecting these is not a simple process. They're usually weld themselves, and you'll never be able to get them off, and you'll end up destroying the exhaust and having to replace everything. Mufflers, they love to leak on these. You look at this one, especially with rust. When you see this, that's a bad sign. And this particular car actually have leaking mufflers. They're not too bad. Take a listen to that. They love to leak, and these mufflers are extremely expensive, and there's 2 of them. So you replace one, a few months later, the second one starts getting loud. And with this car being so quiet, you will hear when these get loud. Rear suspension. There is not much that goes wrong with these rear suspensions, honestly. The arms, they look very rusty for you. These are all original, folks, and they're perfectly fine. The only thing that could happen after a while is the wheel bearing, which is not the easiest in the planet to replace. If you want to find that out, I did one on my car. It was not fun. And then the brakes do have wear sensors. So only on the passenger side. You notice this wire going here? Every time you replace the brake pads that are worn down, replace those. They're very expensive from Lexus. If you want to go aftermarket, that's fine on this one, because all this is just a little wear pad, not an issue. But otherwise, on the rear, you don't have a lot of issues except one. This is the headlight height sensor, and that is the connector that goes to it. We're not even going to disturb this one because this is a rusty one. They are notorious to have headlight leveling malfunction, and you pull that connector, it's full of corrosion. Very common on these, and usually the first thing you look at is this. If you have a automatic leveling headlight malfunction, super common. These sensors, if you take them out, they will break on a rusty car. They're very common. They're kind of expensive, so that's some of the things you got to look for. We kind of skipped over the transmission intentionally because that will be the last thing we talk about. There are actually two transmission options in the LS430. The pre-facelift model had the 5-speed transmission, and while it is a very good transmission, it's not as good as a 6-speed. Truth have to be said. 6-speed gets better gas mileage, has WS fluid, which is a better fluid, but in the DIY world, the other one will be better, the 5-speed, because it has a dipstick. This does not have a dipstick. Very simple and straightforward to replace the fluid. This is the drain, the 14 millimeter. The 5 millimeter hex is the standpipe. I do have a video on how to replace sealed transmission fluid. You should change it every 60,000 on these and 30,000 on the other ones. I hope people have been doing that, because otherwise these transmissions, they could develop a leak here and there, you know, as they get older from seals, but they're not known for a lot of issues unless you really don't change the fluid, and then they go. But there is one small note. This oil pan originally did not have a gasket. They had a sealer, and especially the older ones. If you have one with a sealer, these bolts are notorious to break, the bolts for the oil pan. So before you go wanting to replace a filter here and open the can of worms, as mechanics like to call it, just change the fluid and leave the filter alone, because if one of these bolts break, you're going to have a big problem and you'll be leaking internally. That's the thing with these. Folks, that is the LS430. It is such a beautiful, beautiful car to own, and the truth have to be said. And one thing to be said about these, if you've never been in an LS430, there is not a single car you will get into today that is made in 2023 that will be this smooth, let alone something like a Rolls-Royce or a Bentley perhaps. They're extremely smooth, they're extremely quiet. This engine is such a masterpiece. I mean, you run it, it almost feels like an electric car. You won't feel it at all. And some of you have said in the comments in previous LS430 videos that we've done that should we replace motor mounts? Do they wear out? They actually do not. And the only reason they wear out is somebody decided to replace them in the aftermarket. These are beautiful cars, and if you have an opportunity to drive one, drive them. Just be careful when you buy one, understanding that their maintenance will be a little bit higher. If you buy the right one though, they are DIY friendly, so some stuff you can do on your own, and that is your LS430. Folks, I hope this video is helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some other videos, and until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.